Thanks again for joining us. Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a decree on what the Kremlin has described as unfriendly actions of certain foreign states and international organizations. The document, however, does not provide any details of which individuals or entities may be affected by the measures. The decree forbids the export of products and raw materials to people and entities that it has sanctioned. It also prohibits transactions with foreign individuals and companies hit by Russia's retaliatory sanctions and permits Russian counterparties not to fulfill obligations towards them. The decree says the Russian government has 10 days to compile lists of foreign individuals and companies to be sanctioned, as well as to define additional criteria for a number of transactions that could be subject to restrictions. Well, Russia is in another hot water with Israel over comments by its foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, for saying German dictator Adolf Hitler had Jewish blood and that the most ardent anti-Semites are usually Jews. Israel's foreign minister, Yair Lapid, condemned Mr. Lavrov for the comment and demanded an apology, as Lavrov had made both an unforgivable and outrageous statement as well as a terrible historical error, saying the Jews did not murder themselves in the Holocaust. Russia's foreign ministry now accuses the Israeli minister of making anti-historical statements. Russia has repeatedly made baseless claims that the Ukrainian government is run by neo-Nazis as a justification for its invasion. Analysts think the war of words between Israel and Russia risks becoming the most serious diplomatic crisis between the two countries in recent times. In other developments, French President Emmanuel Macron has held a 2-hour call with his Russian counterpart. Now, Macron's last conversation with President Putin was on March the 29th. Both had been in touch via telephone. Before then, Macron had said his telephone calls with Putin concerned him and were not pleasant. His hopes for a ceasefire had appeared dim in the context of what was happening on ground in Ukraine, citing atrocities against civilians by Russian forces in Bucha, and that France was gathering evidence in Russia's actions as a crime should not go unpunished. Macron's efforts at keeping open communication with the Russian leader had led to criticism by some, both at home and abroad. And Pope Francis has decided to join in efforts at getting the Russian president to reconsider the invasion in Ukraine. Earlier today, he told an Italian newspaper that he had sent a message to the Kremlin 20 days after the Russian invasion via the Vatican's diplomat, offering to travel to Moscow to meet President Putin to discuss the war in Ukraine, but has not heard back. This is the first time the pontiff has mentioned Russia or publicly named Putin since the start of the war 2 months ago. But Francis said he had recently had a 40-minute Zoom call with the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, and says that he spent the first 20 minutes of the call reading out all the justifications for it. But Francis said the Patriarch cannot transform himself into Putin's altar boy. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson says the UK will be sending more arms to Ukraine in the coming weeks as part of a £300 million support package. He was addressing MPs a few hours ago, telling them the UK will send Brimstone anti-ship missiles and Stormer anti-aircraft systems, along with armoured vehicles to evacuate civilians from areas under attack and protect officials. According to the Prime Minister, the support package will include radars to pinpoint the artillery bombing Ukrainian cities, heavy lifting drones to supply Ukrainian forces, and thousands of night vision devices. These, he says, will aid the UK's long-term goal to fortify Ukraine and prevent future attacks.
In military history about the future, I have one message for you today. Ukraine will win. And they said that this rudder of yours would have to be reformed outside Ukraine, maybe even in Poland or in London, perhaps. And I refused to believe it. And today you have proved them completely wrong. every one of those military experts who said that Ukraine would fall. Glorious chapters in military history and in the life of your country. The so-called irresistible force of Putin's war machine has broken on the immovable object of Ukrainian patriotism and love of country. This is Ukraine's finest hour that will be remembered and recounted for generations to come. Your children and your grandchildren will say that Ukrainians taught the world that the brute force of an aggressor counts for nothing against the moral force of a people determined to be free. As you turned the Russian army back from the gates of Kiev, you not only accomplished one of the greatest feats.
In the meantime, normal diplomatic relations are slowly returning to the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, the latest being the UK's ambassador to Ukraine, Melinda Simmons. Ambassador Simmons has described seeing shock upon shock on the road in Kiev as she and her staff return to the Ukrainian capital.
We drove through that, of course, because if you take the car, you come, into Kiev Oblast, then you can see just how hard Russia tried to take Kiev, and also just how quickly the focus became on hitting civilians and attacking civilians. And that is shock upon shock. We passed, bombed out playgrounds, bombed out schools, hospitals, burned out trees, twisted metal in farmland. So obvious, really, that right from the beginning, this was about hitting the Ukrainian nation. It wasn't just about taking out the military capability. This was my home. For 2.5 years, it's been my home. And I've travelled this country, north, south, east and west of it. I've got to know it incredibly well. I know many people who are fighting, and I know wives and children of people who are fighting. It's incredibly emotional for me, and also for my British friends and colleagues, for me to be here. It means an enormous amount for me to be here. I think that speaks to their inability to understand how Ukrainians value their nationhood. This is Ukrainians defending themselves against an invasion so that they can live peacefully. There's nothing more than that.
Meanwhile, the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine hopes to return to Kyiv by the end of this month if conditions permit, so says the Charge d'Affaires. U.S. diplomats departed the Kyiv Embassy nearly 2 weeks before Russia launched its invasion February 24th.
I would say the message to Russia is you failed. Ukraine is still standing, the government is still functioning, and we're going back to Lviv first and then Kyiv to help the government. Today is my first day back in Ukraine, and we're doing it as a day trip. We expect to continue to do day trips for the next week or two. And then we very much hope that the conditions will permit us to go back into Kyiv by the end of the month.
The Danish embassy also reopened Monday following its closure immediately after Russia's invasion. The Danish Minister of Foreign Affairs made the announcement when he visited the Ukrainian president in Kyiv. He described the move as a very strong symbol of the Danish support for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
Thank you very much.
Now, according to one analysis, the EU has spent more than 47 billion euros, that's about 39.4 billion pounds, on Russian fossil fuels since the invasion began. Last month, the bloc's top diplomat pointed out that the 1 billion euros being sent every day to Russia in form of energy payments was 35 times more than the sum the EU had actually donated to Ukraine to help it defend itself. The EU is worried its dependence on Russian fossil fuels is inadvertently helping the Kremlin to fund the invasion of Ukraine because a significant proportion of the payments are taken by the Russian government in tax. In fact, in 2021, the International Energy Agency estimated that revenue from oil and gas made up 45% of Russia's federal budget. Hungary has reiterated that it opposes a ban on either fuel. And you'll see that Germany is the world's top importer of Russian gas in 2020, and this is buying 42.6 billion cubic meters. And this, according to the International Energy Agency. Hungary, too, was one of Russia's top gas buyers, taking 11.6 billion cubic meters that year. The European Union as a whole bought 41% of its gas from Russia in 2021. Well, joining us for more on that is Mr. Tilewa Adebajo. He's the CEO of CFG Advisory and also an economist. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Welcome. Should the EU go ahead with a ban on Russian oil, do you think?
Well, at this moment, it's very difficult to ban Russian oil. There's this issues around energy security. There are contracts in place, and any ban might lead to a breach of those contracts, and the penalties can indeed be very severe. So it's going to be very difficult at this present moment to do the ban. So I think over a period of time, maybe about a year or so, then I think the EU as a whole can begin to shift their dependence. This also raises a question of energy security, because as you know, most people have been moving towards renewables. And it's clear that renewables are not just ready. And I think even the EU are going to be looking more in the areas of nuclear power and other alternative sources of power, especially nuclear, to be able to bridge this gap. And I think this is going to have long-term consequences on these issues of energy security.
But when you hear what countries, some countries in the EU are saying, and this is also especially Germany, saying that it's not against the ban, but then, you know, a sort of stoppage might really affect it, but then it's willing to go, the whole with whatever decision the EU decides. Where do you think they're getting that from?
Well, first of all, Germany is the most vulnerable at the moment in terms of their dependence on Russian oil and gas. So obviously, they're going to be looking at alternatives, but they're also within the European Union. So while Germany is going to be pushing for significant changes and looking for alternative sources, it still has to carry the European Union along in terms of their overall energy strategy and the overall energy security for the European Union.
Yes, and, you know, the European Union also, they're expected to do a lot more this week, and they call it the sixth package of EU sanctions against Russia. What's your take so far? Are these sanctions having any impact? And this is also seeing what Russia has done today, and that is a decree, a sort of retaliatory measure to firms, companies that are taking, maybe unfriendly companies and that are taking this sanctions against it. If we see an embargo on buying Russian oil, how much of a blow do you think also this would deal to Russia in terms of the revenue that's accruing to it at this point?
Well, there's no doubt that Russia has lost maybe about 40% of its revenues as a whole in terms of the impact as to what's going on right now. But as you know, most of the European countries are still paying Russia for this. And the ban, it's not going to affect it until maybe a year down the line. So eventually, Russia is going to be hurting. And of course, the EU countries also are going to be hurting because they're going to be looking for alternative sources of energy from newer suppliers, which invariably is going to be more expensive. So in a trade war, nobody wins because the whole of the global economy is about dependence. Many countries have resources that other countries don't have. So there's this interdependence with the global trade. Some people have comparative advantage in certain areas, and some people don't. And that's the whole essence of global trade. And invariably, both countries are going to suffer from this, not only Russia, but the EU. But again, the EU is going to now begin to take more significant and concrete steps, as I said earlier, to begin to secure its energy security and maybe look towards nuclear fuel more than anything else.
And Hungary doesn't, of course, agree with the EU's position, and they're clearly stating that. I wanted to take you to perhaps some of the impacts of the Ukraine war, and this is what we've heard from the IMF, Sub-Saharan Africa. We were told that a promising regional recovery has been disrupted by that war in Ukraine. Last year, I think the projected growth was from 3.7 to 4.5%, but now the war has sort of introduced a new development, saying that 2022 will slow to 3.8%. What do you see ahead for Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, to be honest with you, I think Sub-Saharan Africa is not really impacted significantly by this war. I think the biggest countries that have issues with this are Egypt, is a big importer of grain from Russia and Ukraine. Then there's iron and steel. But again, there are many other alternative sources for these products. There's an inflationary impact globally. But again, yes, because of the slowdown of global trade and global economy, sub-Saharan African economies are going through a recovery period. And I think the biggest threats, even to the sub-Saharan economies, are the high prices of oil, which is really what's going to impact more of the sub-Saharan economies more than anything else. The war might be the cause of the price increases in oil, but again, I think we'll see some adjustments going further. But there are many things that we can do in terms of structural reforms within the sub-Saharan economic continent to be able to buffer ourselves from the impact of these this downturn that's been caused by the war, namely increase in oil gas prices and increase in the prices of food commodities, specifically wheat, and also in terms of iron and steel products.
And this is what you think policymakers should be doing, seeing as the prospects for borrowing costs, global demand are becoming increasingly uncertain. But if you were to look at Nigeria and, its effects, what would your advice be for policymakers here?
Well, it's ironic for Nigeria in terms of when you talk about advice for Nigeria, because oil prices at $100 a barrel should be a time whereby we're having a windfall and we should be happy about what is coming through. But unfortunately, we're paying $4 trillion in subsidies, which is a significant amount of money. And so this is we're not putting ourselves in the best position. There's a lot of fiscal restructuring that needs to happen in Nigeria. 80 to 85% of our revenues are going towards debt service, which is not sustainable. And the debt service numbers are becoming high. Our debt numbers have gone over $100 billion. We still have about 20 trillion naira ways and means financing within the Central Bank of Nigeria that still needs to be reconciled and which is causing inflation. So there are many issues in Nigeria that are internal. But the fact is that at this point in time, $100 barrel oil should be in our favor. But unfortunately, because of the way we've managed our fiscal management, has resulted in the fact that we're not benefiting from this. So it's important that some of this subsidy, even if not all, is removed for us to be able to restructure and give us some headroom to be able to put money into productive sectors of the economy that will grow it in a sustainable manner.
Right, perhaps that's also not what a lot of people would want to hear, you not being in favor of subsidy, seeing as Labour...
but that's the reality. Unfortunately, that's the reality we face in Nigeria today. And I think it's important that Nigerians should know that 4 trillion naira is a hell of a lot of money to be paying on subsidies. That money can build at least 2 refineries.
All right, we always appreciate your time on the program. Thank you, Mr. Tiliwa Adebajo, CEO, CFG Advisory and economist. Always a pleasure having you join us on the program.
Thank you very much, Millicent.